Welcome to On the Line. I'm Christine Williams. Coming up for discussion on our Viewpoints panel, the overhauling of the Safe Schools Act deemed to be biased against black students. Later on, you'll be meeting a former contestant of The Bachelorette. Stay tuned. And these are the issues we'll be presenting today to our Viewpoints guests for commentary. The overhauling of the Ontario Safe School Act, known for its zero-tolerance policy against violence. It was deemed biased against black students. The cost of our soldiers' lives in Afghanistan. How has this grim news impacted our views about the mission as well as our image? And the sad case of 3 university lacrosse players in North Carolina wrongly accused of sex assault. What would justice dictate now? Later on, you'll be meeting a former contestant of The Bachelorette. But first, let's meet our Viewpoints guests. John Thompson is president of the Mackenzie Institute, and Paul McKeever is the leader of the Freedom Party. Thank you both so much for joining me today.
Thanks for inviting.
Now, the first case we're talking about, in fact, the first newspaper article, it concerns the overhauling of the Safe Schools Act. Now, there's been a lot of debate behind this. Basically, what it fosters is a whole zero-tolerance policy when it comes to violence. And as you can see from that headline, it's now being deemed a kinder, gentler Safe Schools Act. The essence of this article here, it says below that larger headline, special needs students suspended more often. Now, in the article, it identifies the black students, saying that, well, they're the ones being suspended most often. And I know that certain members of the NDP party said basically what the Safe Schools Act amounts to is a gang recruitment act. Nothing to do with these students once they're expelled, so they go into society and they make more trouble. The other side of the argument says, well, why throw out the baby with the bathwater? 2 sides to this, and I'm going to start with you, John, and hear what you think about this. Do you think it was time to make it a gentler act, according to the article?
Well, the problem is this is really tricky ground.
Very much.
Because let's remember the other side of things. The other students who are now being protected from disruption. In other words, the quiet students who stay in class and don't have to worry about constant problems. But yes, I can accept the point about gang recruitment. I can also accept the point that, well, someone will probably issue the old racism button and hit that again, and I'm surprised it still works. But there are communities with more family problems than others. You know, it's often a consequence of immigration or lack of integration. It changes in time. But right now, the fact that there are going to be some minorities where there's more troubled or disproportionate number of troubled youths than in other cases.
Okay, now what do you think of this?
Well, to my mind, the application of justice should know no face color or anything else. It's just about people. So if a group defined by some genetic trait is for some reason more statistically getting affected by the act more than other times, well, that's just the berries. That's not something that we have to say, well, let's go lighter on in a given constituency because of their race, color, creed, etc.
Well, to me, this whole racial argument could end up really backfiring in the end, because what are you suggesting here by saying it unfairly targets the black community? What you're basically saying, on the other hand, is that you've identified the black community as being a problem. You've actually put them in that category of troublemaking. So why not just look at the whole school, the issue of violence as a whole, and try to find some system of dealing with it, as opposed to perhaps putting other children at risk?
Let's just be careful here. When we talk about a black community, what black community?
Yes.
I mean,
and that's what's identified in these articles.
Yeah, there'll be kids there from Caribbean islands that are perfectly quiet and stable. They're good, hard, students. There'll be students from other backgrounds that are going to be troublesome. That's just the way they are. And yes, if you say they're all the same group just because of their skin pigmentation,
to me, it's worse.
You're wrong. But the other thing is also special needs. If you start identifying these kids as being special needs, and saying, okay, well, now we've got to protect them, you're actually sort of encouraging this behavior,
Good
giving
point.
permission. I mean, the real philosophical question here is when you've got trouble. I mean, do you tear a bandage off slowly or quickly? You know, do you do what you have to do? And then hopefully within people from that particular narrow group will realize they've got to smarten up, as has often been described to them told to them by their own leaders. Or, you know, will they say it's someone else's fault, it's the system's fault, we're being victimized, and then perpetuate the trouble that, you know, we see already.
Good point. Paul?
Yeah, you know, I'm not big on the idea of any community being defined by race, creed, color, etc. To my mind, there's one society full of human individuals, and that's it. And when people start pulling out this community and that community, they're really breaking up, balkanizing society, and I don't think it's productive at all.
Well, you
But
see, it ends up being used
Oh,
for
yes.
a political advantage. This is what I'm seeing here, because on one hand, when the black community is identified in terms of crime, it's called racial profiling. When it's identified in the case of, well, the Safe Schools Act, it's identified here as, well, we're looking out for your interests. So from the point of view of always identifying, if you find that statistically there's some kind of a distribution along one line or another, how about dealing with that problem and trying to identify what the problem is, as opposed to trying to alter a whole act based on it? I mean, that's my concern about the issue here.
And if you look at the Education Act, which is what the Safe Schools Act modified, we're talking here, when we talk about suspensions and expulsions, we're talking about things that under the criminal code are either lesser offenses or greater offenses. We're talking about carrying guns to school, alcohol, distributing alcohol to minors.
Yes.
We're talking about being drunk at school. We're talking about violence. We're talking about rape. These are the things identified as the issues under which a person has to be expelled. We're not talking about being unkind. We're talking about criminal offenses. That's when these suspensions and expulsions are supposed to occur. So I don't want to see any of that modified. I don't want crime going on in my schools. And I think we have to remember that the purpose of a school is like a garden.
Yes.
And that the children's minds are these flowers. We're trying to have them bloom. And if someone chooses to be a weed, we don't ask, well, why are you a weed? Or can we turn a weed into a flower? We say, pluck the weed and take the weed somewhere else.
Take
care of the weed elsewhere.
One point that was made in this article, and this was the suggestion with the new Kinder Act, have one kind of expulsion done by the board for at least 21 days with alternative programs that must be completed before return to school. I mean, I applaud that, but why not have that tagged on to the Safe Schools Act, as opposed to talk about changes to the Safe Schools Act and then add that on?
Right.
Again, you're looking at a situation here of throwing away the baby with the bathwater. What do you think?
Well, there will be all sorts of perspectives, all sorts of agendas and hidden agendas, all trying to change what is currently in place. Again, a suggestion like this makes a great deal of sense. You know, take all the troublemakers, put them into some other place and say, okay, you know, you're going to clean your act up, you're going to behave yourself, and then you can go back into normal schools along with everybody else. Anything else is going to be special pleading by one group or another, and it's only going to be self-defeating in the long run.
Yeah, and let's
Yes.
not forget why we're in this situation. We've forced everybody through property taxes. If you want to live anywhere, you have to pay property taxes so that they can have a public school. These are in a sense prisons that we make with tax dollars, and you have to go there, and few people can afford to pay the bail to get their kids out when one of the inmates decides to get violent. That's the problem. And I think the focus has to be on saying, look, you don't have to be here. If you don't want to, you can take your money and expend it in the school where they don't allow violence to occur. But as soon as you say everybody has to pay in, then you've got a special situation where, you know, some people are unfortunately in a situation where their children are violent, but they're still paying for that school. And so there's some injustice in saying, take them out if you're still paying for that school.
The argument for that is always the universality of education. We
Yeah.
see it in the medical system as well. How would you argue that? Now, I have to ask you that quickly because we're going to have to move on to the second
I'm
topic, Paul.
opposed to tax-funded schooling, period. The idea is that you should be paying only the school that your child attends and not the school that some state thinks that it wants you to support. And that would clear up all of this mess, frankly, because no school would manage to keep dollars when they had violence in the school.
Wow. Okay, and we're going to go for a break now. When we come back, while we all know the situation going on in Afghanistan, we'll be discussing two sides, two schools of thought after this. Stay tuned. Hello again and welcome back to Viewpoints on the Line. The second issue we're talking about now, the headline from Vimy to Afghanistan. 90 years ago, not long ago today, April 9th in fact, 90 years ago, we saw that heroic act of Canadians. Now, I know the pacifists, the peace activists and so forth, they'll condemn all the world wars and so forth, but we see a situation here. And unfortunately, simultaneously, we had a horrible tragedy happen in Afghanistan where we lost at the time 6 soldiers, and more recently, 2 in addition. It calls into question on both sides. Some people say, well, what are we doing there? Other people say, well, we're there to liberate the people of Afghanistan from the Taliban. And still you have the other side that adds in, we are in a battle with terror, but once again, it calls into Canada's identity, often seen as peacekeepers, but often not recognized that even in peacekeeping, as in Bosnia, we still fight as part of the whole role of peacekeeping. That's my worth here, what I'm saying from the point of view of this. My basic question here when you look at this, there are arguments on both sides when it comes to who are we as Canadians when it comes to our image before the world, what are we trying to achieve here, and is it worth it? I mean, those are the big arguments here, and I'm going to start with you this time on this one.
Yeah, I think it is. I think it is worth it if the purpose of being in another country is to defend Canada from aggressors, then it's worth it. I'm not a big subscriber or supporter of the idea that American or Canadian soldiers should be in another country to give them, purportedly to give them democracy. It doesn't work that way. You can give people elections, but elections don't a democracy make. And so, so if you're over there to annihilate the enemy, I say go for it.
Do you think Canada being in Afghanistan is protecting Canadians somehow?
Well,
as part of this whole terror issue?
Yeah, from the publicly available data, I think the evidence is pretty clear that the Taliban was effectively, again, a garden that was nurturing terrorists that actually did come to North America to attack us on a symbolically military, economic, and political fronts. By bombing the associated buildings, and that was a message that they hate Western values of freedom, and Western values of freedom, that's my Canada. So I'm quite happy that Canada's over there making sure that they can't breed more terrorists.
Mm-hmm. What about you, John?
Well, I don't think there is a debate. First of all, the whole peacekeeping myth is a myth. It's a misnomer.
But it has a lot of a following here.
And it shouldn't. It's from people who know nothing about what our military has been doing permanently for 100 years. I mean, and besides, the day of the Blue Beret peacekeeping mission is over. That concept is dead. But we do have an older military tradition which ties back to World War I. And that is a tradition that Canada is a country where to protect our own security, we look after the security of other people. To protect Canada, we were in Europe and Asia in World War I and World War II.
That's right, to prevent a cancer from spreading.
Yeah, and that's what we do, and we do it very well. We are in Afghanistan to protect ourselves. Incidentally, we're also trying to give the Afghan people a hand up, and they desperately need one. But it's not out of sheer selfless altruism. It's in our own best interest, and that's why we're there. It's the active front in the jihadist global war. Because make no mistake, we're in another world war right now. But the whole idea of sort of this interferes with our tradition of peacekeeping, phooey. Peacekeeping was never what so many of its supposed defenders imagine it to be. In fact, almost all of our peacekeeping missions involved combat.
Yes, and this, again, is the area I want to emphasize, because a lot of people will find it surprising that, yes, we were in Bosnia, and I'm just highlighting that as an example, keeping peace, but we were on the ground doing battle. This is what goes on in peacekeeping. But it seems like until now, since we have the soldiers and the heavy media publicity going on in Afghanistan, that people somehow didn't realize that much of the same has been going on peacekeeping missions. But the media has not been getting a hold of it the way it has in the situation with Afghanistan.
We had hundreds of people killed and injured on peacekeeping missions, often by deliberate hostile fire. The Syrians knocked down a Canadian aircraft with 6 of us on board. We had another aircraft shot down when we were doing a peacekeeping mission in Vietnam in 1974-75. We had 130 people killed and injured in the former Yugoslavia. And of course, people going about our tradition as peacekeepers, well, the Medak pocket, people don't even know what that battle was about. They know nothing of it. And you go back, there's the television moment that always drives me nuts. One of the heritage moments of Cyprus in 1964. you know, and the Greeks and Turks quarreling in the street, and along comes the Canadian telling everyone to be cool, go back to your homes. Actually, that 64 involved combat. I know that one case where basically a number of Greek Cypriot soldiers were shot to death to stop them from shooting anti-tank rockets at our supply trucks.
Yep.
Now, yes, go ahead.
Well,
Paul.
I think violence is a phony issue. I mean, violence and peace are not the criteria for action and inaction. You can have violence that achieves a just result and that's designed to achieve a just result. For example, whenever a police officer is forced by situations to pull the gun to kill the guy who's otherwise going to kill somebody, we don't say poo-poo bad violence. We say congratulations, justice achieved. And that's what the purposes of the forces are abroad as well. People are wanting to use violence inappropriately, so we use violence appropriately. We use it defensively. They want to initiate violence against us, we say no, and we annihilate them.
But there are those who, they don't understand the concept of what you're saying. In fact, they'll say, well, if it was your kid, you might feel different. I mean, we cannot minimize the deaths that we're seeing. No. We cannot minimize this, and I don't think that's your intention one bit. It's a sad, sad story. And when I heard about these 6 that were brought in, and they were taken along the 401 and the street, well, the highways, the areas were littered with people to pay tribute. Flags were up. I mean, it was heartbreaking listening to this, and we certainly don't want to minimize that. I mean, we look at even this case with Vimy Ridge here, where 3,500 Canadians were killed. I mean, it's a tragedy war, but then you also hear the other side that says, look, if you don't fight this, and I want to hear what you think about it here, you're going to end up with not only those deaths, but a war on your own soil, that you'll end up with those deaths, and in addition, thousands, hundreds of thousands more. Some people will say that's propaganda, but I want to hear what the two of you think about it.
Sorry, John, do you mind if I jump in first?
Yes, both of you go ahead.
You know, death, we don't really per se remember death. Lots of people die every day. The reason that soldiers are specially remembered is because they fought for their own lives and for the lives of those they loved and cared about.
They're heroes.
And they fought so hard and so persistently, and they were so dedicated to their freedom and the preservation of life, that their death is proof of their dedication. That's why we value them. And also, they were successful. Let's not forget. They took what other forces could not take at Vimy. And that's what I think we have to admire about the people who are dying in Afghanistan today. They are trying to achieve a just result. We don't value their deaths. We certainly honor them for having fought so hard to achieve life and to protect life. And that's what I honor and admire about them. And I don't think we should at all denigrate the dead. They were people who were most dedicated to freedom.
Definitely. John, anything to say before we go for a break?
I was in a military family. I had relatives die in World War I, World War II. Both my parents served. I have my brother and one of my brothers, my sisters, also served. I was in for 13 years. And when I was buying that lottery ticket for 13 years, my number never came up. Although I did notice people, even in peacetime, military personnel get killed and injured even in peacetime. It's a hazardous profession. And it's the constant risk of sacrifice all the time. And this is part of the job. Now the thing is, as you were arguing, that it has to be effective. It has to mean something. In Afghanistan, it does. And it's a peculiar, the people who say, oh, we protect our soldiers, bring them home. Basically what you're doing is then squandering what we've lost. The other side of it is that actually those who we've lost are an investment towards actually achieving a positive result. In this case, letting more children go to school, letting girls get educated, building roads so people can rebuild their lives.
And the people of Afghanistan are actually applauding this tremendously. I interviewed somebody about this that's doing the groundwork there.
And we saw at Vimy, the French turned out in record numbers, 90 years later, to say thank you. We'll be seeing the Afghans doing the same thing 90 years from now, if we stay and if we keep doing the job we're doing.
Wow, well, you're certainly speaking from experience. We're going to go for a break now. When we come back, we'll be talking about the 3 lacrosse university players unjustly accused. We'll be talking about that case after the break. Stay tuned. Hello again and welcome back to Viewpoints on the Line. The third issue we're discussing, well, it's a story coming out of North Carolina, Duke University, it's gained certainly North American-wide attention for a good reason. Here you have 3 college boys that were accused of raping gang raping a black stripper at a late-night frat house party. Now, 13 months after those, they've been dropped. It's a scandal right now because even the prosecutor was deemed basically ruthless in his pursuit of these 3 boys. And in fact, according to this article, self-motivated here because apparently he was in politics and he wanted to gain the African-American voters in Durham, a city where, according to this article here, of 120,000, where almost 45% of the residents are black. So he went ahead and just went after ruthlessly these boys without any DNA evidence. Now it's being said that these boys were now accused wrongfully, and the scars are left. Yeah. But you see, it's interesting the way the article is done. A tragic rush to accuse is what it's called. But I'm wondering here if perhaps what comes next, if it shouldn't be a tragic rush to excuse, because all I'm hearing here is that this girl has mental problems. Now, I do not underestimate the issue of mental problems, but I do realize that sometimes it can be difficult to define. You could also argue, well, anybody who would do something like this, you can say they have mental problems, but does that excuse them from any kind of a responsibility? This is something we see in society. Unfortunately, this has been turned into a racial issue. I actually heard somebody argue that these boys are actually guilty and it's some conspiracy to make black people look bad. Something else came up. Another article talks about lessons from a witch hunt, where it was dug up that 20 years ago, something very similar took place by a 15-year-old girl who actually put herself in a garbage bag and claimed that 6 people had raped her, and it turned out to be a bogus as well. Unfortunately, it's been turned into a racial issue. My big concern is what's going to happen to this prosecutor, the injustice that were done to these boys, and something that really irritates me, these women that come out and scream rape when it didn't happen, they do an injustice to all women that are genuinely attacked and to their credibility. Yes. Huge issue that I find frankly disgusting, and it should have never reached this far. I'm going to start with you, John.
Well, I'm reminded in this case of the old novel by Tom Wolfe, Bonfire of the Vanities, and the movie that people may have seen. Also, witch hunt. Go back to the Salem witch hunt. Mm-hmm. You had hysterical teenage girls who started to make accusations. People paid attention to them, and before it was over, 13 people were executed for witchcraft, of all things. Here again, you've had the same thing. Now, in this day and age, I mean, it's a long history of false accusations that people will make for various reasons. Happens all the time. But in this day and age, for a prosecutor to go ahead in the days of rape kits, swabs, and DNA testing, to go ahead with charges without actually having the most fundamental convicting evidence, DNA evidence, secure before the charges are pressed, is inexcusable. Mm-hmm. That man is deserves to be sued for every cent he has.
And sued.
The other thing is the way that, again, and it's a function of the hysteria of society, and hysteria of society works for different reasons. 300 years ago it was witchcraft. This time it's, it's purported sexual assault with racial overtones. The way that Duke University suddenly piled in on top of the team these 3 boys belonged to, the coach was fired, the team was disbanded, everything else. And there are people in the...
and their reputation suffered as well, Duke University. I
Sure.
mean, their enrollment just went right down.
Well, there are people in the faculty of Duke who again deserve to be hit with a civil lawsuit that's extremely punishing.
Yes.
You do not engage in prosecution for populist political reasons.
We'd like to think we live in a democracy where innocent until proven guilty.
Well, they had the right to make a big thing out of this case and to pile on these kids, and now they have the right to accept the consequences for it.
Mm-hmm. Good point.
Well, this case is about racism, and it deserves to be about racism, loud and clear, but not racism of 3 men who were wrongly accused, because clearly they weren't racist. They didn't hurt anybody. The evidence was overwhelmingly the other way, as I understand it. But there is horrible racism by the prosecutor, who has decided that the electorate, and I think that unjustly decided that the electorate itself is racist, and that if he panders to their color, the color of their skin,
plays up to the thing,
that they will somehow vote for him. We see this, by the way, not just in the southern states. This is going on right here in Ontario elections. I mean, I'm the leader of a party. I have to, in many cases, come to the task of recruiting someone for a by-election or an election. And I witnessed the most abominable decisions where the parties that have seats in the legislature right now pander to what they believe are statistical norms. If it's a highly Italian, overwhelmingly Italian riding, they will literally pull someone out of any riding they can if they have, top credentials plus they're Italian. And they think that people will vote Italian just because, well, there's mostly Italians here. That's so racist in its foundations.
Well, it's political posturing, which we know we could argue against, but it becomes such unscrupulous politics. I mean, for somebody to play a sad case as this and not care about the reputation of the boys,
and to
the money that was put into these cases, it's ridiculous.
Let's be honest. I mean, it's not just race. I mean, if there's an accusation of rape, I mean, most men...
There are many problems that I see attached to this particular case.
I mean, if I was living in Duke, even being who I am, I probably would have gone, holy cats, these guys deserve to get hit. I mean, there's a contempt that most men of every race reserve for someone who actually commits sexual assault. But that's, again, what the justice system is supposed to be for, the checks and balances. In this case, it worked because these guys could afford good lawyers. God help them if they could only afford a public defender, which is why, on the other hand, sometimes you see particularly horrendous crimes in the U.S. and more blacks disproportionately on death row than would otherwise be the case. But again, the prosecution has a duty to make sure the evidence is sound. And this time, they clearly failed.
Yeah. I like to support the side of justice, but I'm going to mention something here that I don't think is addressed enough in society. When women start making these accusations, it's against all women, I said that earlier, who are genuinely attacked. Do you think that follow-up charges should be placed on women that make these accusations against men? I want to hear what your point of view is. I mean, you're going to get some really diehard feminists out there that are going to say no, but I mean, I'm talking here, to me, it's not an issue whether you're a man or a woman. It's an issue of justice, and even if you want to look at it on behalf of women, justice for the women who are genuinely attacked. Do you think these women should be charged after doing this?
I think they should only be charged if there's evidence that they intentionally laid a phony information.
That's what I mean.
Yeah, and that's going to be difficult. It'll be an exceptional case where that's true. You have to be very careful about charging people who bring information, because sometimes the only reason that the person walked, the only reason they got off the hook was because of a technicality, a charter issue, etc. So you have to be careful about assuming
What if it's proved and they come out afterward and they say, okay, fine. They're caught, because this happens, and I know this, where they're caught. Their story doesn't add up, and they get to the point where they break down and they say, okay, fine, I made up the whole thing. Do you think that they should be dealt with by the law after that, or it should just be let go?
As harshly as possible, and doubly so if it's a police officer involved doing it.
Yes, if it's a police officer or somebody else in a position of trust laying false charges. For other people, you really have, it's a variety of circumstances. It is a very human problem that you put your foot wrong. Whatever really happened in this case, that say she's out too late, her boyfriend is getting, or I'm not speaking about this case in particular, angry, and then she says, oh, well, I was raped. What? And then you commit yourself to a lie and you follow it. It's a very human mistake to make. It happens enough times. So
I'm not even talking about those subtleties. I know that it exists where false accusations are made against people. Even if you go out there, okay? We're talking about an issue here regarding a sex assault.
Yeah.
But it happens in other areas where somebody says some crime was committed against them and it didn't happen, or somebody, gives some false witness against somebody else. But shouldn't these people be dealt with? Like this girl, should she be let off? Should she be let off and just... Well, she's a head case. And
I don't know enough about the details. I can see, if this was deliberately concocted, if she was looking for personal advantage.
Yes.
Yeah, maybe.
But it should be followed up. This is something that needs to be looked into, I believe.
Yeah, there are deliberately done criminal acts all the time for which people don't necessarily go to prison because they are mentally ill. If, for example, if they're clinically insane by the legal standard. And those same standards, I think, would apply to any person who brings a false information intentionally. But that's a strong. I mean, you better have your evidence lined up that you were insane, because otherwise, no mercy. That's probably the worst thing you can do to anyone, is to bear false witness against them. And
Their reputation is ruined.
not only that, but it really undermines the entire system of justice. In fact,
it
it's a
does.
slap in the face to the justice system itself.
It is. It is. And we're out of time for today. Thank you both so much for joining me. We're going to go for a break now. When we come back, you're going to meet a former contestant of The Bachelorette. He'll be talking about MySpace, My Kids. Name of his latest book. Stay tuned.